you have a Bible this morning and you want to read with us, we're going to take a reading from the book of Mark, chapter 14. The book of Mark, chapter 14, and we're going to begin reading in verse 32 and probably read down to verse 42. Yeah, we'll go 32 to 42 in Mark, chapter 14. Mark has 16 chapters, so we can kind of assume we know what's coming, right? That this is the last night before Jesus' crucifixion the next morning, and of course his resurrection. So we're into that part of the book. And this scene is going to begin in the Garden of Gethsemane. And there's so many thoughts that can be drawn from this text but we want to draw one thought that is mentioned 3 times in the text to bring before you today. Book of Mark, chapter 14, beginning in verse 32. It says, "And they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he saith to his disciples, Sit ye here while I pray. And he taketh with him Peter and James and John, and began to be sore amazed, and to be very heavy, and said unto them, My soul is exceeding sorrowful unto death. Tarry ye here, and watch. And he went forward a little, and fell on the ground, and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt. And he cometh and findeth them sleeping, and saith unto Peter, Simon, sleepest thou? Couldest thou not watch 1 hour? Watch ye and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit truly is ready, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed and spake the same words. And when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. Neither wist they what to answer him. And he cometh the 3rd time, and saith unto them, Sleep on now, and take your rest. It is enough, the hour is come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise up, let us go. Lo, he that betrayeth me is at hand. And that'll conclude our reading this morning. And the thought that we'd like to bring before you today involves verse 34, verse 37, and 38, where Jesus uses a certain idea towards his disciples, makes a request of his disciples. So the title of our message today is Being on Watch. Being on watch. Now, throughout the New Testament, this phrase in the Greek is translated into the English in a multitude of different ways to where I don't think we get the same emphasis that perhaps was intended in the New Testament. But that phrase had a very specific reference. Many people perhaps in the military, if you've been in the military, you may have used that language. Being on watch is someone who is being assigned a task to literally watch. That a military person would have been responsible, particularly at night, especially as when it's of its greatest importance. Everyone else is sleeping, everyone else is resting, or perhaps have been assigned to other responsibilities. And so one or two or a few are responsible for watching the gates or watching for the enemy or any peril or danger that might be ahead. If you remember in the Christmas story, the same thing is said about the shepherds. They were on watch at night. The obvious reason they were on watch is because sheep have no way of defense. Furthermore, the darkness prevents them from being able to run or perhaps do something in light of danger. So the idea of being on watch is fundamentally about there is something of great value, and exposing it to risk is something that needs to be considered. We don't want to expose it to any risk. We want to protect it. So in the New Testament, sometimes Paul says, be vigilant. And it's the same word. He's saying, be on watch. Now, to really hone in on this, this is not a casual observation. Have you ever done somethsomething and it's not the assignment itself that is taxing, it's the rigor in which you do the assignment that is really tasking. So for example, if you pick up a magazine and you begin to read it casually, it's not really that draining of an activity, at least for most people, right? If you have a homework assignment next week, and this is going to determine whether you graduate or not, the rigor that you put into knowing the things that you're reading is a very taxing thing. It's amazing how you can sit in a chair all day and get exhausted. But the reason is because the intent of what you're doing is so serious, and the stakes are so high, and your energy invested is so significant that it's physically taxing and draining. And so the nature of this idea is not just be aware or conscious of something. It's not simply put your eyes on something. But there is an intent and a rigor beyond idleness. So you think of a car, goes on idle. If you put it on idle, it's going to move forward. But it's not until you push the gas. But when you push the gas, you better be careful and more attentive. Because the faster you go, the more at risk you're putting yourself, those in the car, and those around you. And so in the same sense, when the Bible talks about being on watch, it's saying that there is an intentionality and an engagement in what's going on beyond something that is casual. You can't do other things. So oftentimes you'll see today, people who are responsible for watching kids will say, and this is me confessing my sin here, all right? All of a sudden, if you're staring at your phone and a kid starts crying, you're worried. Because you were on watch. Or have you ever caught a kid, like, again, confessing my sins here, climbing something really high, and it probably took them a minute or two to get up there, but you were distracted. And then all of a sudden there's that panic. And it's twofold, one for the kid's welfare and one for your own welfare if your wife catches you in that predicament, right? And so, in all seriousness, watchfulness is something that is intentional and must be done at the exclusion of other things. Now, Jesus here, and I want to paint for us, let me back up for a minute. As a young person, I want to ask you this question, and as an older person, who is on watch for your spiritual life? Who's the one that is stationed and is vigilantly watching over the activity of your spiritual life? Making sure that your spiritual disciplines, that you're staying devoted to the spiritual disciplines that are bringing you closer to the Lord. Making sure that you're confessing sin and repenting of sin. Who's on watch with that? Because there comes a point in our Christian walk where parents are primarily responsible for being on watch for their children's welfare. That both keeping the bad out, but also doing what can be done to purify that bad tendencies within. And a parent is responsible up to a certain point for vigilance and care, that they're protecting their child and simultaneously they're putting reinforcements in when necessary over things that could hurt their child. But there comes a point in every person's spiritual life where they have to relieve their parents of that post, and they themselves stand in that position and say, now the person primarily responsible for the strength of my spiritual life is me. I am standing post. How many times have you seen it? Perhaps many, when, and this isn't reserved for young people. A family attends church. Family grows up. The children have children. They're still attending church. And then the patriarch or the matriarch dies. And then the kids stop coming to church. Stop engaging. So it begs the question, who was on watch all those years? And while that second generation was perhaps on watch, were they really watching? Or were they distracted? Now, what this scripture reveals to us is the, how do I want to say this? The extreme neglect that we can give to being on watch. There's no place more in the scripture where neglect is given to spiritual things than right here. The fate of all humanity for eternity is at stake in the next 24 hours. All the promises of God, all the salvation of mankind is placed upon the shoulders of one man, Jesus Christ. And he's about to face something that all of eternity will be insufficient to reveal, and that is the omnipotent wrath of the Almighty God. And he's facing this. This is not just a Goliath with 5 brothers. This is a suffering the likes of which can never be expressed in words. And Jesus must face this enemy. He must face this suffering, not with the chance of reinforcements, or not like you and I as the people of God do, with the assurance that God's Spirit will never leave us or forsake us, but rather Jesus is about to face the wrath of God, knowing that God himself will forsake him. And Jesus is troubled by this. And he is burdened, and he is emotional, and he is emotionally breaking down, and he's emotionally feeling great need. And so he pulls his 3 friends away. He says, come here for me for a minute. I need you to keep watch and pray with me. In other words, I need help. Now, where his friends failed, God eventually sends angels to do. Isn't that sad? Like, would the ministering angels that were sent to the Garden of Gethsemane even have been necessary if the 3 that God had given had been there ministering to his needs as friends are meant to do? Perhaps, perhaps not. He calls them aside and he says, watch and pray. Now, you might say, they didn't know what was ahead. I beg to differ. Because what we have recorded in the scriptures is 11 times prior to this moment where Jesus makes explicit references to his death, his betrayal, who would do it, how it would be done. There are 11 times, and the last week, approximately 6 times if I remember right, in the last week, he's saying, this is what's going to happen this week or this night. And so it's not ignorance that is leading them to neglect their post. Imagine what an advantage it would be if we knew when the thief was coming. To use an analogy that Jesus gave in Matthew 24:25 about the day of the Lord, he says the same phrase is there, be on watch, for you know not the hour. And if he had known the hour, then he would have prepared for that man to break in. And so, yet what this is showing us is that sometimes it is within our capacity as human beings to know what is going to occur and still be apathetic towards the responsibility despite the gravity of what is at stake. And so I tell you that not as a point of condemnation, but to warn you against our own nature that we share, that there can be things of great value, and yet our hardened, careless hearts can still discount the significance and importance of things that are clearly laid before us. The apostles did it. How often have I felt conviction about the fact that my own children stand on the precipice of eternal destruction, and my heart at times can be largely unmoved. And yet, if you drill down for a few moments, and if the Spirit of God enlightens us in those moments about the gravity of it, it's something that would cause us to tremble and fear. And so Jesus sees them like this. He says, be on watch, be on guard. Now, why is it the sake that we need to be on watch? And I think this is an area where there's some gratitude that we can have towards the Lord, but it also, there's a trade-off to it. In our nation, we're so secure in so many ways. More so than any nation that I know of or has ever known, that we have a very organized and powerful, I guess you would say, system to protect us both individually and collectively. To the point that our safety is just kind of an assumption for many of us. We just assume nobody's going to break in, and if we do, we've got all these plans, we've got all these people that are going to come help us, and our nation borders, we've basked in the freedom of never having a war on American soil from foreign entities. For years and years and years, we have just rested in freedom and security. And that trade-off is to then assume and to translate that to the spiritual realm, to think the same safety we enjoy there is the same safety that we have been given spiritually. But we got to back up for a moment and consider what the scriptures teach us. Because what we find is there are enemies that are seeking to destroy. So here's what I want to say to you, young person, today. If you are not on watch with your own spiritual life, there's a good chance there's already an enemy inside your gate. It's more likely than not. Be it through certain attitudes and character qualities that you have developed by not being vigilant. Isn't that what you find as you get older in your spiritual life? Is that well before we ever get to that demonic enemy, Satan, don't you and I find our own flesh as Christians to be the single greatest enemy to our spiritual prosperity? That my own, and as Jesus is warning them here, notice that he's not warning them against Satan, he's warning them against temptation. And what was that temptation? I think he tells us when he says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He's saying that there is a natural weakness in our flesh that we will give in to the cravings or the weaknesses of the flesh rather than push through with the spiritual necessities. And how often do I find that to be true in my own life? Where something desperately needs prayer. There's a situation, there's a person who their spiritual condition is at high red alert, high alert. And man, over the next month, over the next few weeks, likely how that they respond to the suffering they're going through, how that they respond to the difficulties that they're experiencing is likely going to determine the path of either drawing near to God or running away from God. And I see the need. And yet the distractions and the weakness and the preoccupation with self hinders me from being on watch for the welfare of their souls. Here, Jesus is telling us, watch, be attentive, and pray. He uses the same language in 1 Peter 5:8, one that you all know well about Satan, right? That he's a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. That he's subtly looking to sneak into your life. And so not only do we have the flesh and this fallen nature rising up in us behind enemy lines, right? It's getting behind the front lines. And it may infect our personalities and our attitudes and our character with things that God resists, like pride and lust and covetousness. And so our own sinfulness has come because we've not been vigilant and on guard. Maybe bitterness has crept into your heart towards people in your life. And bitterness, man, that can do, you're talking about something that can metastasize quick. When you begin to blame somebody else for your problems and you're bitter about it, man, how many lives have been destroyed over something like bitterness because people didn't do what Christ told us to do. And that is when a seed of bitterness is planted, that rather than come and offer our gift at the altar in a state of worship, that prior to worship, we go back to that person and we reconcile with them and then bring. So God is saying, before you worship, go and remove whatever may be between you and your brother or you and your sister. Why? Because God knows how important it is that a root of bitterness can grow and choke out all of the good fruits of a Christian life. And yet, why does that happen? Well, it can happen because we're just not on watch. We're not vigilant to pay attention to the state of our attitude and the state of our heart and the default attitudes that we have towards one another. But there must come a point if we're on watch and we're studying the scriptures and we're praying and we're enjoying Christian fellowship that while we're doing those things, that suddenly it becomes apparent to us that there has something risen up as a prominent part of who we are that is incongruent to the way the scriptures teach us to be. We're on watch, we're seeing it. Maybe you like the limelight. You're proud. Things you say, the things you do, always have this subconscious almost intention to have people speak well of you. I'm not so concerned whether people think I'm proud. I'm really concerned whether I really am proud, you know? Because listen, the more you show pride, the better you can camouflage it. Because you realize it's embarrassing. Jesus says, being on watch. Not only do we have to fight our flesh, then there's Satan. We have an enemy. I remember behind this very pulpit listening to a lesson Brother Steve Skinner's taught. If you ever get a chance to get online and listen to it, it was one that really impacted me. At the minister school back, I don't remember what year it was, but it was called The Adversary. I'll never forget, he's probably preached it here before. He's a former pastor, so I'm sure that he's alluded to some of these points. But one that really stuck out to me at the very beginning of his lesson, he said, I want you to imagine he landed, you know how he was a great storyteller. He landed in Vietnam, got off a helicopter, and there was this beautiful green jungle that just lay out in front of him. Just amazing to see. He said, you're almost mesmerized by the view of it until you realize that hidden within that green, lush jungle were thousands of men whose sole objective was to kill him. Suddenly, it wasn't so beautiful anymore. Suddenly, guess what you felt the impulse to do? Be on watch. Now, How do we be on watch? I'm glad the scriptures do not leave us helpless, right? Here's what I always felt like as a kid. I don't want to accuse anybody of this because it's probably my fault in interpretation. Sometimes here's what I felt like the preacher would do. He'd say, okay, you don't need to do this. And then he would give me the three big solutions to every spiritual problem. Pray, read your Bible, and come to church. That's just going to solve everything. So when I began my Christian walk, I began to pray, read my Bible, and go to church, and it helped nothing. Are you allowed to say that at the pulpit? Yes, you are. It helped nothing, right? Because I was going through the motions of those things. But they were spiritual disciplines to cross off a list, not true, intentional ways to be on watch for my soul. For example, when you read the Bible, little side note here, when you read the Bible, you ought to pause often and reflect upon its application to the state of your heart. That's how you learn. That's how you grow, is by reading something like this. Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth. And then you pause. And you meditate. And you say, Lord, are my thoughts constantly on laying up treasures for myself? And then you go back through your thought life. And you begin to dwell and meditate upon the way that you treat money. Why that you want it. What you plan to do with it. How would you respond if you got a whole bunch more of it? And you begin to ask the Lord to open your heart and open your mind and reveal those hidden things that are in your heart. And yet all that came from one small phrase in the midst of a verse that is packed full of meaning, in the midst of a sermon that is 3 chapters long that will mess you up if you let it. Because you pause. And maybe it takes you 2 or 3 weeks to get through one line of Jesus. Because in it is this depth of application that God says, I need to clean every corner of your heart before you can move on. That's being on watch. You know, again, I'm off task here, but I'm going to say it anyway. You have to want to also get it cleaned, right? You got to want to know the answer. You know, here's an unfortunate thing, I think. There are people who want to know the truth, and there's people who want to know the truth as long as it aligns with what they want to do. The line between those two, imperceptible. You don't know when you're on one side, when you're on the other. So sometimes I have to beg the Lord, Lord, I'm saying to you I want this. I doubt it. I doubt it. Change my heart to where I want it. Please. In our text here in Acts chapter 20, if you'll turn there real quick, I want to point this out. Same language is used here. Same language. Except in this case it says, take heed. Same thing. Be on watch. Now, for those of you that were with us on our Wednesday nights a year ago, we were in the book of Acts. Paul here is concluding his 3rd missionary journey. Remember when he went to the second one, he quickly went through Ephesus. They asked him to stay. He said, I can't. I got to get back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. Then the next time he went out, if I remember correctly, he went through Galatia, and then the first place he went was Ephesus. Now, what this little story is going to reveal to us in 19 and 20 is that Paul comes to Ephesus, and he really invests time. How do we know that? Well, let's look. I wasn't going to say this here, but let's look at verse 31. It says this. This is kind of the end of what I was intending to read. He says, therefore watch. So be on watch, be on guard. Now he's speaking to the Ephesian elders. Okay, so if you remember, at this point, he is heading back to Jerusalem where he knows he's going to get apprehended, and he tells them here, I will never see you again. And so every stop along the way as he's going back to Jerusalem, I believe in his mind he thinks he's going to die when he gets there. And he almost does, because he's almost beat to death. And so all these people, as he's going back to Jerusalem and making all these stops where he had planted churches, they're weeping because they're saying, Paul, and they're even trying to persuade him from going, because they're saying, they're going to kill you. Your fame is spread abroad everywhere. And these Jews hate you, and they've already tried to kill you in outlying places where synagogues are at. Imagine if you go to the heart of Judaism, which you're viewed as an opposer of, they're going to kill you. But the Holy Spirit had revealed to him, you have to go back to Jerusalem. So Paul's on his way there. The last prominent stop is here in Ephesus. Why is this a prominent stop? Well, in chapter 19, what we learn is that Ephesus became an epicenter for missionary activity. And so if you remember, he spent a total of 3 years there. And in one case, he's speaking at this university, and it says all of Asia has been influenced. And so here's why I say this. Paul had been at this place and seen spiritual prosperity at its finest. The gospel had affected even so much that if you remember in the previous chapter, in chapter 19, those men who had made idols for the goddess outside the temple of the goddess of Diana, they were saying, we need to kill this man because not only is he eliminating the need for our trade, there's not going to be a need for the temple of Diana because of the good that he's doing here. So these people have seen spiritual revival at its finest. But what was one of the contributing factors to that? Why were they seeing such prosperity? Well, we know first and foremost, it was because of the Lord, period. The Lord was the one enriching their lives and allowing the word to be as effective as what it was. But listen, there tends to be two types of Christian people, how we view the work of the Lord. There's one people who think, well, God's just going to do whatever he's going to do, and I'm along for the ride. And I'll give a little bit of effort, and I'll give a little time and energy and money and all the things, but God's going to do it or he's not. There's some people who think unless they do it, God can't accomplish it. But what we find in spiritual work is something that we find in no other type of work, that God reveals over and over and over in the spiritual realm. And there's this unresolvable spiritual conflict that arises. I'll give you an example of this. One, God sent his son. Another, Jesus gave his life for ransom for many. Well, who acted first? They both did. Equally sacrificial. So one gave or sent, is another place it says, and yet one gave. That perfectly illustrates the work of the Lord. In one sense, we know nothing will be accomplished without God's Holy Spirit empowering, enabling, and accomplishing the work. But it requires on our end watchfulness and effort and the giving of our lives in order to see it accomplished. Except a seed fall to the ground and die, it remaineth alone. But if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. And that comes at the heels of Jesus saying to the people, die to yourself, pick up your cross and follow him. And so we see this, on one hand, I'm not going to steal God's glory by saying it was Paul's good work that accomplished it. But I'm also not going to nullify the principle clearly taught in scriptures of what Paul did in order to see the Ephesus work be fruitful. Look what he says in verse 31 of Acts chapter 20. Therefore watch, and remember that by the space of 3 years, I cease not to warn everyone night and day with tears. Let's break down this verse for us just a second. First of all, so we see the word watch there, so we know it's talking about the same thing. Being on watch. Those people would immediately have the idea of a military garrison watching. The next thing, for 3 years, he watched. Now, what I know about the military, if I'm being real honest, I learned on Band of Brothers. Okay? I don't know a lot about the military. Here's what I do know. Common sense will tell you this. The longer a man's on watch, the harder it is. He needs a break. Needs a break. Yet, extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. If you're in the middle of a skirmish, nobody's watching the clock and saying, well, I'm not on watch right now, it's somebody else's turn. And in the same way, when a victory is being won, nobody's saying, listen, I'm off watch, no. So what's happening in Ephesus if we put chapter 19 and 20 together? Well, in 19, the gospel is exploding. Paul recognizes this extraordinary time that God is doing something. Now, Old Union Church, listen to this because there might be some parallels. God is at work. Now God is on duty. And he's fighting. And the enemy that seemed to prevail against the whole Roman world is now being shot down with great force and power that they have peeled back the spiritual fortress that they had built all throughout the Roman Empire by the power of God. And God used a few ordinary people to go all throughout the world and spread the gospel. And the word is being efficacious and it's going everywhere and lives are being changed and new enrollees are coming in. And so Paul is saying, listen, I'm not worried about being on the clock or off the clock. I'm not worried. I am going to give watch because God is working and victories are being won. And so for 3 years, he stays in Ephesus. As you read the book of Acts, it seems like it's not according to plan. You have to deduce that yourself. That's how I read it. He's skipping from city to city to city. And then all of a sudden, 3 years, there he is. He says, for 3 years, I was on watch. And I ceased not to warn everyone day and night. So, there's other references to this in the scriptures where Paul is going house to house. Acts 2:42 tells us the same thing about the apostles after the church had Pentecost. They're going house to house and they're doing these things. Why? Spiritual victory had been won, and they're making sure that the enemy cannot have a resurgence and take over the things they had just conquered. In other words, we have a group of young Christians here at the church. We can win them for a time. And what Satan can do is retreat temporarily, gather his strength up again, wait until human nature gives in to its instinct, and that is to stop being on watch, because he knows that about us. He knows our tendency to revel in spiritual victory and not consider that they're going to regroup and come back. Paul says, for 3 years, day and night, I was doing this. I believe him. I believe it was day and night. I'm not saying he didn't take days off, but I'm saying his regular routine. I know it because when I go down to Antigua, Guatemala, 5 days a week, they week for church. 5 days. Every day, except for 2. You're going on Friday and Saturday, the only days accepted. You're going to a village full of orphans, and you're serving them, and you're sharing the gospel and the love of Christ with them. You're going to another village that doesn't have the gospel, who is deceived, and you're sharing it with them. You're having Bible study in your home every day. When he says every day, night and day, I believe him. Why? Because the spiritual significance, the value of what was going on required special vigilance. So Paul gave it. He wanted to make sure the victory was sustained and the ground won remained theirs. So I ask you this morning a couple questions. Number one, if you are a mature Christian among us, you're not in military terms a private anymore. That distinction or that label should not be used very long of us. If we're really seeking to please the master, and you've been given watch, maybe what the Lord does is this. Maybe the Lord gives you a special interest with one person in the church that's a young Christian. And your heart is just, you delight in that person, the younger person. Why don't you be on watch for them? You don't have to tell them. Why don't you be on watch for them? Praying for them, seeing to their welfare spiritually, engaging with them as often as you can. Because right now they're just a private. Privates are dumb. They don't know the way of the master. They don't know the way of the military. So you're going to do it for him. Paul says night and day he did it. How did he do it? With tears. I love that part. It's an important part of it all. Here's where I think religious culture has kind of done an overcorrection here. So in the last 15 or so years, there's been a resurgence of intellectual Christianity. Okay, and so it focuses on homeschooling, it focuses on catechisms, it focuses on doctrinal creeds. And it's like if I train my kid from the time they're 5 and I instill in them all of these things and I protect them from all these things, they're going to come out spiritual giants. False. That's not what's going to happen. They're going to come out as spiritual elitists who think they're better than everybody else. Paul didn't come in here like he did the Areopagus, spouting off philosophy. He came among the people into their homes with love and tears and truth and warmth and kindness and gentleness. He came to them the same way Jesus came to us. And to do that, he had to die. Give his life to do that. It takes time, it takes effort to be on watch. And he did it. And now think of the joy that he just experienced here. Here's what's happening, and I'm done. He's passing through Ephesus. He says, just a couple years ago, nothing Christian was here. No established churches, nothing. And now I'm leaving, and I'll never come back here. And he didn't say, let me call together the few band of followers that I've seemed to drum up here. But there were a bunch of elders. So people who had been established in the Word, ordained, and whom God felt were mature enough to handle the oversight of Christian communities. He calls them together. And he begins to basically say, hey, now you're on watch. I probably shouldn't talk about this, but I'm going to anyway, just because the mouth won't stop this morning. That's how every pastor wants to leave a church. When a pastor resigns, I want to leave when the church is strong and there are elders. Not that we're transplants. I have no problem with transplants, but not that we're transplants. That were raised up and cultivated among us. That basically what would happen is you take one pastor out, you put another one in, and the church just keeps humming along like nothing had taken place. Otherwise, you've built the church on a man that's not Jesus Christ. Paul is leaving, and he's saying, you guys are in good shape. Which is incredible, the growth they experienced just over a 3-year period. This morning, I want to encourage you younger people to ask yourself this question. If you're not watching over your own Christian life, how many enemies are within your gate? And the thing about those enemies, they rear their head at the worst possible times you could ever imagine. You know that? Here's when they rear their head. You just got married. You're learning the whole marriage thing. Then you have a couple of kids. And you're highly stressed. And your relationship is not par excellent, right? it's not going great, and you're bickering about things, and you haven't got the whole kid juggle thing, and then all of a sudden, the enemies of the gate, they begin to storm you. And if you've been on watch, man, you have a world of reinforcements in that say, greater is he that is in me than he that's in the world. You can say something like this, man, this is really hard, but I can feel the presence of God helping me in the hard. And that's what Callie and I have talked about the last 6 weeks. Her dad passing away. Oh, it's sad and it's more. I can feel the Lord. And I can mourn. But I can know he's there helping us. You're not watching the gate. There are enemies within. You got to purge them and stand on watch. As a church, we've seen good growth recently. It's made us responsible for things of more value. Let us be on watch. Thought of this. Watch is not the same as paranoia. They're different. Paranoia is built in suspicion of ill intent on behalf of people who should not have an ill intent. That's where paranoia comes from. It comes from the fact that we think that the enemy could possibly beat us. So we're so paranoid. No. Watchfulness is not driven by paranoia. It's driven by the love for what you've been entrusted with. I lock my doors at night. Why? Not because I'm paranoid, because I love my children. And I want to make sure that I'm being vigilant and wise with the stewardship I have of my children. Their minds, their hearts, their bodies. This morning, I want to encourage you to be on watch. Be on watch. So many more things I could say this morning that that have just rested in my heart this week, but I'm going to stop there. Somebody have a word on your heart, something you feel the need to say today, maybe in addition to the message or something else.